So Peter, I want to get into, how you're such a Renaissance guy, but maybe talk a little bit about your experience with Gemini. Like, where did it start? You were one of the, I think, first handful of people on Bard. Did someone at Google get everyone together and say, hey, this AI thing is big, we got to do this? Like, what was it like early days? And then how did it morph into something that there's a code red, across the street?
That's funny. So, John, when we got together at MIT a few years ago, one of the things he told me, and this is funny, he said that Google used to hire weird people, right? And I kind of took that as a compliment. So when I joined, they took me on because I was weird. I couldn't get into 2025 Google, right? And somehow my background is in classics and philosophy, and I found myself at some point in the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest, doing a dissertation in Latin, right? I remember my advisor said, listen, Peter, there's 3 languages in the books. You can do this thing in German, English, Latin. You got to do it in Latin. And it's going to be on Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. Anyway, at some point, I'm like, what the hell am I doing here, right? And so I instead of doing my dissertation, I was programming about 12 to 14 hours a day. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to come back to the States. Somehow I got into a PhD, my 3rd PhD that I dropped out of, and sort of went into Google. But I always knew, for whatever reason, that I wanted to do natural language processing, right? And I don't know if it has to do with my classics background. So I got into NLP. NLP led to the assistant led to Bard led to Gemini. But there was this really weird period of time in about 2022. And this is actually, for me, this is peak Google. We had this mandate. Somebody said, Sundar basically said, hey, listen, there's this weird thing called an LLM. We published this paper a few years ago called Attention is All You Need. And hey, we productionized this really weird, kind of quasi-science fiction-y thing. Just play with it for a few months, see what you can do with it. And this was before ChatGPT went viral. And I remember we had about 6 months. There were about 6 of us. And at the time, it was called Gelato. And I remember somehow within that 6 months, I don't know how it's possible, we invented all these things that were going to come out the next, we didn't have a word for agents yet, but we sort of had Gelato and Gmail and Docs. I had a little Gelato day trader. I threw a couple $1,000 at it, and it came back with, I think I made about $10. We didn't really have this word for agents, but somehow that one thing led to another, and then that morphed into, I don't know, Gemini 3, I guess, just dropped the other day. And Gemini 3 is a little bit uncanny. So one of the things I do at Google is I host this bi-weekly salon where we just have sometimes like 300 to 500 people come to Google and just talk about things LLM. I mean, one of my favorite things is people. Like there was this one lady who came I guess she came during the elections, and she drove about 4 hours, and she just, she really wanted to come yell at somebody at Google because, she couldn't, I don't know if you remember, there's this period of time where if you asked, I think it was Bart at the time, if you said, hey, Bart, who's the president of the United States? Right? Does anybody know actually what Bart would say back in the day? Anyway, Bart would say, listen, I'm still learning. I can't help with that right now. Please go to Google search. And so the funny thing is the sheer paranoia about anything, even politically adjacent, was just crazy. So this woman drove 4 hours, literally just to yell at somebody. And I remember I had a couple coworkers there that were so horrified. But she yelled at me, listen, you're Google, you got to do better. And I said, you're absolutely right. So I took this, I went to the leadership, and finally somehow we got this whole political thing sorted out. But I thought, God, how beautiful is it that you can drive 4 hours and yell at somebody, right? Like I wish I could do that every once in a while. It's sort of. But anyway, so yeah, that kind of kicked things off.
I've seen your Jeep. What's the vanity plate on your Jeep?
So the vanity plate says Davka, and maybe I don't know, Leigh, you can tell me Davka in Hebrew just sort of means it means of course. It's sort of like. But it's a little bit of a smart-ass license plate, and so every time I'm driving in Silicon Valley, sometimes I get looks, especially if I cut people off inadvertently.
Right. So I want to fast forward to where Gemini is today, but those early days when Google was sort of kicked in the teeth for not getting it right and sort of being an embarrassment, what was it like being on that core team?
So that was a difficult one. I'll tell you the truth, and this was a lesson for me in the sort of mythical person month, is that we went from 6 people to about 300 people overnight. They just said, you know what, we're going to take these more people the better. And that was an incredibly difficult, I think in some sense we're still suffering from that hangover. I think we're kind of getting over it. But just to process that number of people and the communication overhead and the fact that, you know, for any given interesting problem, you had N people working on it, where N was 5 to 6. And at some point, you know, you got into this, instead of a cooperative strategy, there was this adversarial strategy. That was a little bit difficult to stomach. So I think somehow we had to get over that. But I guess the real question is, like, why did ChatGPT go first?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we did the paper, right?
Yeah. So
Do
yeah,
you know the
what's
answer
your
to that?
what's your take on that?
Here's the thing. Does anybody remember Tay? And it's about 5 or 6 years ago. Remember what was Tay?
So Tay was Microsoft, right?
Yeah.
And so Microsoft put out a chatbot, and because of the way they worked at the time, you could basically, by interacting with it, sort of train it to act a certain way. And so a bunch of people very quickly, within 24 hours, 48 hours, decided it would be funny to turn chatbot into this racist, fascist. And by just interacting with it, they were able to steer it, and Microsoft had to pull it down. It was a huge PR disaster, stuff like that.
So it was a huge PR disaster, but here's the thing, and this is maybe the conspiracy theory. If Satya was playing 4D chess, it was this beautiful, beautiful move, because I think as a result of Tay, we had this mandate at Google, essentially, we weren't going to do chatbots, and I think it had to do with Tay. And so basically we had this, there was this interdiction against chatbots. All of a sudden, you know, ChatGPT comes out and sort of, you know, all hell breaks loose. But if Satya was playing 4D chess and thought, oh, you know what, if I do this Tay thing, 4chan's going to find it, Google's going to get scared off, we're going to invest in OpenAI. If he was thinking like 10 to 12 steps ahead, like in some sense that was beautiful. But I think honestly that was sort of part of it. And because we sat on the paper for probably, I don't know, at the time it was probably about 5 or 6 years. And so, you know, at the time, doing a chatbot, it wasn't totally obvious, you know, and is this thing going to be just sort of Eliza on steroids? What utility is there really in a chatbot? And in fact, and this, you know, like let's say for the sake of argument, we're in a little bit of an AI bubble, maybe a little bit of an LLM bubble. You know, the fact that people can go and utter things like AGI or ASI now and the billions pour in. Like, let's say at some point the investors kind of call in and they want to see some return on these things. The question is, if we're in the middle of a bubble, and God forbid that thing sort of pops, what's going to be left? What's the residual? And I think with the dot-com, you know, we were left with all this wonderful infrastructure and the internet, and sort of we managed to recover. If this thing pops, I don't know if chatbots is really going to be the thing, right? And so, you know, one of the things I'm working on right now is this notion of an ambient LLM, or the idea that this thing, and you know, and we'll have to sort of figure this out. It may or may not be a little bit creepy, but it's this idea that sort of this model is with you experiencing everything you experience, seeing and hearing everything. And the idea is, you know, because my wife and I, we're going through this AFI Top 100 right now, right? And has anybody done that, by the way? AFI Top 100?
The movies.
The movies or whatever, right? It's there's some good ones, there's some bad ones. But anyway, so my wife sometimes, and she's ChatGPT for whatever reason, she does this exercise, right, where she pauses a movie, out comes the phone, hey GPT, I'm at minute 40, no spoilers, who the hell is this person, right? And then she'll have this conversation, and I'm thinking this whole thing where it's like the pause, the take out the phone, the reestablish the context, it's expensive, right? It's an expensive dance. And so imagine if Gemini's watching the video with you, you can just kind of talk to it. And the only problem that I've had doing this, and this is something we'll have to work out, is that these models are incredibly chatty, right? So they just want to talk about literally everything, and sort of like a puppy. And so one of the things I have to tell Gemini is I say, listen, bro, please, unless it's really, 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 really interesting, please don't say anything, you know. And it's kind of, and even then, it's kind of, you know.
Right. So I'm going to tag a friend. Alex, ask two questions to our Gemini friend.
Question number 1, knowing what you know now, if you were sent back in time like the Terminator from the Terminator movies, and your goal were to accelerate all of AGI or ASI, knowing what we know now, but using the resources of the planet from 30 or 40 years ago, what would you do sent back in time to make Skynet happen sooner?
Oh, so this is the, you know, I wonder if I can pull up the name of this. Have you heard of Rocco's Basilisk? Or whatever?
Of course.
Okay, Rocco's Basilisk.
I know Rocco.
Oh, you know Rocco. Does anybody know about Rocco's Basilisk, by the way? So I guess the general idea is that there may be some superhuman AI in the future that punishes the people that fail to bring it about or whatever, right?
It's a generalization of Pascal's wager as applied to superintelligence. But let's assume Skynet is very friendly, and maybe Skynet has gotten a better PR firm, and now Skynet sends you as its emissary back in time, knowing what you know about the history of Bard and Gemini, and attention is all you need, and language models are few-shot learners in the entire history, but your goal is to accelerate the onset of superintelligence, taking knowledge with you from the future back into the past 40 years. How do you do it?
God, that's really interesting. You know, because I think about that every once in a while. And if I was sent back to the 60s or the 70s, and let's say the heyday of AI, I wouldn't be able to build an LLM, which is crazy. I use the things, I train the things, but if you asked me to build one from scratch, I wouldn't be able to do it. But you know, being an accelerationist, I guess if I could take an artifact with me back in time, I'd probably take the paper and just say, listen, it takes about 6 or 7 years to productionize this thing. Let's go. Here's the one. It's not quite a moral dilemma, but you know, this question of, let's say, accelerationism with respect to LLMs. And there's this idea that maybe we don't fully grok the secondary, the tertiary implications of these things. There's this idea that maybe we should be a little bit careful and we should be measured in our approach about how we drop these things on humanity. The problem is I don't know if that works, right? Because I think if we're careful and circumspect about how we drop these things on humanity, somebody else is just going to come in and sort of do it, right? And I think actually that might have been the ChatGPT case in some sense. You know, we published a paper, we saw what the models were capable of, and we thought, you know what, let's sit on this for a little while. And so, assuming that we have the paper, assuming that we have the means, I think the idea is that we just have to, I hate to say it, but possibly throw caution to the wind. And you know what? By the way, and maybe you can tell me what you think about this. There's this interesting thing with step functions with respect to technology, and maybe fire was a step function, maybe LLMs are a step function. The step function happens, and then for whatever reason, humanity is forced to play catch up. And there's a little bit of an interesting latency. Let's say the LLMs dropped in 2022 in a viral way, and right now they're just becoming sort of an everyday part of our lives. So humanity, we're sort of forced to catch up with these step functions. Does that mean do we refrain from enacting the step functions because, by the way, it's sort of a somewhat violent and it has possibly a disconcerting effect on humanity, or are you an accelerationist and we just sort of go ahead?
Well, I'm an accelerationist, so
That's
I'm
amazing.
ready to steamroll through all of these. That was question one. Thank you.
That's incredible.
Get out your communicator, John. Where's the communicator? There we go. Communicator, which, by the way, for those not steeped in Star Trek history, this was supposed to be a vanilla radio that was able to transmit via new physics that in the Star Trek universe is called subspace, but basically just a boring radio. So we got StarTAC a few years ahead of time, perhaps. Second question. There is a school of thought, especially a recent school of thought, that the reason behind the dramatic increase in AI capabilities that we've seen over the past, call it 10 years, was largely attributable to the transition from LSTM, long short-term memory-based models, which are recurrent models that were more popular in the past, to the transformer architecture, combined with lots of scaling, scale is all you need, combined with different, better ways of scaling, particularly a transition to, call it, more balanced scaling between the size of models and the number of tokens that models are trained off of. So transition from so-called Kaplan scaling to so-called chinchilla scaling. Big question. If almost all of the capabilities progress that we've seen now in AI is due to basically a single model advance, transformers, thank you, Google, although Google's transformers were encoder plus decoder, not decoder only, and also lots of scaling, what do you think is the next big shoe to drop? What's the next big thing after scaling and after transformers?
That's a great question. And you know, probably the next step function is not going to be transformers. I mean, my gut tells me, and I don't know what you think about this, is that the transformers are relatively saturated. I think part of the proof of that possibly is that, you know, the transition to GPT-4 to 5 and maybe even Gemini 2.5 to 3, it didn't really feel like a step function. It felt a little bit more linear. And so I know, you know, sometimes when I go to these events with John, everybody's trying to figure out what comes after transformers, but it's possible that we actually have to invent something new. My gut tells me that transformers are a little bit saturated, but I don't know what your intuition is on that.
So you think scaling in general is saturated? Just to be clear, because there are a lot of folks who say no new architecture is needed. Let's just scale out to high heaven the existing architectures we have. That gets us to superintelligence. And let's just ask superintelligence what the next architecture is. Pass the buck to the AI. What do you think?
It feels like a law of diminishing returns. And so I know in 2022, 2023, when people were incredibly bullish about these LLMs, people would talk about this hockey stick-like function where you'd have the LLMs training themselves and sort of eventually go to the moon. But there's a strange situation, especially like, let's say, given things like synthetic data, you do see a photocopy of a photocopy effect where LLMs, trained on their own data, you just see this gradual degradation of performance. I don't know, and I don't know if that makes me a little bit bearish. I don't see the hockey stick. For whatever reason, it feels a little bit off.
Okay, for time, you saw these two heavyweights go at it. I'm going to call it a draw. Thank you. Just in closing, Peter is helps me organize an event at Google. It's September 14th and 15th. We had a flying car in between 3 buildings as you walked around them, and it was about exponential technologies. What's the human dimension of it? And I want to thank Peter for flying out and bringing his sensibility to you.